All right, let's go ahead and get into shoulder movements, the press in particular. I know that from the other part of our audience, coming from like a bodybuilding perspective, I've seen a lot of what I like to call half reps, and a lot of the thought process there as far as trying to isolate certain muscles and get a pump and kind of chase that hypertrophy type training. But we also, at Mind Pump, try to stress a lot of full range of motion and try to express that strength through its full capacity. You had some specific things you wanted to address here with different angles of the press and using the kettlebell with that. So go ahead and take us through that, Mike.
Absolutely. This was a question that came through on the forum, and the question specifically was, during the overhead press, what is the optimal or what is the correct angle of the forearm? Should I be here when I press? Should I be here? Should I be here? My feeling is when you're doing an overhead press, and in a second I'll get into demoing what the movement looks like, but when you're pressing, to start the movement, you're always going to start in the rack position, which is right here. Then you'll press up and into the scapular plane. So the plane of the shoulder or the arm will be directly in line with kind of the angle of the scapula. So you'll press here and then you'll lock out overhead. That's the first place I tend to start people. But just realize that you've got a whole working window. Now this was something that I first learned from working with Paul Chek. And one of the things he showed me was, every single degree that you change, you're hitting the shoulder, you're hitting the upper body slightly different. So especially if you're working, not only if you want to work slightly different parts of the muscle, but you want to essentially extend your set, you can gain a few more repetitions if you use the whole working window. Now, me personally, I don't tend to like to come out here. This can be a vulnerable spot in full shoulder abduction, especially when we think about what is the tool that we're lifting. So with the kettlebell here, the weight is located behind the arm. So here is pretty vulnerable because the kettlebell, how it's sitting on the arm, wants to pull back. So for this implement, I tend to you'll set in the rack, take a nice stabilization breath. You can even, this is a tension technique that we'll go over in a second.
You're gonna irradiate out of that.
We'll irradiate,
right.
We'll go over that in a second. But from here, here's the rack position where the shoulder's set down and away. I'm not moving from the lower body. I'm squeezing the quads, the glutes, a little bit of tension in the abs. And I'll press up overhead. And then I'll pull the kettlebell down. Now what you notice in that was more of a scapular plane press, but also just note I can change it here. This would be,
so you're just going vertical with that.
That would be more pure shoulder flexion. Now that type of pattern specifically we use a lot in kettlebell sport on the jerk, because when we're looking for efficiency of movement, one of the things, let's pick the bench press. What's the shortest distance between 2 points? It's a straight line, right? So when we're pressing overhead, there's just a lot of extra movement here. Not that it's wrong, but we want the shortest distance as much as possible. And also what you tend to see, whether it's because lifters might be a little bit tighter in the upper trap, the levator scap, or they might have tight lats, that's going to pull the shoulders out. So you see a lot of lifters with restricted mobility with kettlebells, they finish here. Now that's, once again, not the most optimal path to travel, and since the bell's here, if you finish in this position where the palm's pointed forward, the bell can more easily fall on the head, which obviously
which you don't want.
Which we don't want. So we want the thumb angle would be pretty much at a 45 or even straight back. And just know you've got this whole window. So you can train here, you can train here. You should train through all ranges. But to start, scapular plane works good. And then in my experience, if you're doing high repetitions, I like keeping the elbow pointed straight up and down.
Now, how do you feel? So in the scapular plane, you do get a lot more of that spiraling sort of rotation involved with that. And my thought process with that has always been, if I'm going to try and get somebody to engage more of the muscles involved around the shoulder joint, that's something that, I'm always trying to make sure that people are keeping connected and active. Would you put sort of a priority list if I'm strength training, instead of just maintaining a neutral position into a press, an overhead position, also adding in that element of rotation?
Sure. I think that, and that's why I was saying, like when you're first starting out, working in the scapular plane, which will definitely incorporate, you'll be here because you're always going to be here in the rack. Then naturally you're going to have to move into a little bit of that corkscrew up to here, and then you'll come down. So that's usually a great way to start.
Okay.
And just some tips on that. When you're pressing, you always want the shoulder set down away from the ear. You don't want to allow the shoulder to hike up. One cue you can think, Justin, can you put your hand right on top of that hand? Right there, or maybe a little bit higher. Okay, so I'm moving through the press, it's in alignment here. The shoulder should be set down, and I should be pushing my body away from the kettlebell. You see how that's down?
There's tension here.
There's tension here. I'm trying to maintain a long open neck position. So this is down, and the same thing on the lowering phase. When the bell comes down, you don't want a passive lowering phase. You don't want to just come down.
Right.
You want to pull the kettlebell in the exact same line path that you brought it up in, and the shoulder's going to remain down and set, or packed if you like that word. I tend to prefer the word set, but both mean the same thing more or less.
Well, we've talked about that before because that's something that is always a cue that I've heard forever, and then it made a lot of sense when you were able to kind of describe that maybe that's limiting a lot of movement there, whereas I want to at least be able to travel somewhat, but keep it set so it's firm in the overhead position, but I'm not completely limiting movement there.
Right, and to just build off what Justin was saying, in terms of the packing, what I was referring to when I said set in an earlier video, it was just trying to avoid the tendency for people to overpack, which means, let's say when someone's over the head, pulling down here. What we're looking for is a long open neck position, a locked out arm, but also with a little bit of upward push on the bell so we're not getting jammed up here.
You're getting both here engaged.
Exactly. So you're almost trying to decoapt or increase the space as well in the shoulder joint. So it is set down or packed down, but there's also some upward push as well.
Right.
And that's going to be the safest kind of position for the shoulder to have full and free range of motion in the joint while maintaining good shoulder girdle alignment and good shoulder girdle integrity.
Man, I love that too, like just pressing in different angles and getting through that. So you actually notice then when you're pressing that you have a little more to give in a different range going through that, huh?
Sure. Yep. And that's a lot of times if I'm doing, let's say, in a pressing set, if I'm doing, let's say, a set to max technique. Max technique I kind of quantify as pretty much going till failure, but not going to where any technical faults happen. In that situation, I might start out here, I might start here, and then I'll gradually, and I'll find because I've got more options, I'm using more muscles, I'll be able to kind of spread the repetition load on a strict press.
Man, that's great. That's great information again. Go ahead and check out our 30 days of coaching and continue this series here with Mike Salemi on kettlebell technique.